Hello and welcome to Lab Coats and Yoga Mats, the podcast where we explore fresh ideas and perspectives on big topics of our time through a blend of evidence-based rigour, holistic thinking and human stories. I'm your host, Dr. Lily, and join me through a series of solo episodes and guest interviews as we get thinking outside the box, challenging outdated paradigms and having fun along the way. So today's episode is going to be a solo chat, and the plan is to talk about creativity, perfectionism, and stepping outside of your comfort zone. Now, I think this episode will be relevant to you if you maybe have a goal or something that you maybe know that you want to try and work towards, but perhaps you haven't gained the confidence yet to do so, or you haven't started taking steps towards it. Or maybe you're in the middle of that journey as well and you just need the reminder. The example that I'm going to talk about is going to be the creation of this podcast. So I've distilled basically what I've been learning over the last 3 months. A lot of it has actually come up previously for me in other areas of my life. So for example, my eating disorder recovery, to be honest, like many of the things coming up for me now are actually very similar to what was going on then when I was healing my relationship with food and body image. So I think these tools really are useful in so many different areas of life, whenever there's something that involves personal growth, essentially. So for some context, I have been really lucky to find an amazing group of friends here in Edinburgh who were keen to share this creative journey with me. And we've been doing something called The Artist's Way. Some of you might have already heard of this, but the book is written by Julia Cameron, who is a very esteemed author, filmmaker, poet, songwriter, like all of the things, very well known and super established. And so she has a lot of learnings from this space. And I think it was maybe back in the 90s that she wrote this book called The Artist's Way, which brought the conversation around creativity like back to the forefront. And her books have sold over 5 million copies, and yeah, it's just full of so much wisdom for anyone on a creative journey. It also has quite a spiritual component to it as well, so like I've enjoyed that for sure. Essentially, I have been working through this book over the last 12 weeks. No, it's probably not quite 12 weeks, maybe like 8 weeks now. And it has been bringing a lot to the surface. It's actually shocking. I mean, it's unsurprising, but for some reason it's been shocking to me, like quite how applicable everything that she has been saying has been to my own creative journey. I have learned so much along the way. I'm probably going to have to save a conversation about The Artist's Way and specifically around creativity for another time, because I think there's so much in there. But the key things that I really wanted to touch on today are mainly around perfectionism and growth and stepping outside of your comfort zone, and how to do it in a way that is sustainable and is not going to push you beyond what you're comfortable with. And part of this is because I actually haven't done this right myself over the last few months. There've been periods where it's worked really well, and then other periods where I've pushed it too far, and it's nearly caused me to completely stop and go back to square one and do the safe thing, which is just to not do anything at all, right? And yeah, part of this has been like learning from mistakes. So I just wanted to share because, well, not only is it helpful for me putting this together, but also hopefully it might be helpful for some of you who are also on a journey of growth, and maybe you're doing something creative or you want to start sharing your gifts with the world and you've been feeling some blockages to doing that. So let's jump in. I have my journal here with all of the notes that I've made. So the first point that I wanted to touch on is the importance of action. This is such an interesting one, and this is something that I've come up through lots of different avenues. It's come up by doing The Artist's Way. It also came up at my previous company where I was working on an acceptance and commitment therapy app, which is a branch of CBT essentially. It's a branch of therapy. And something we were talking about there was the concept of committed action, which is is also very much the same thing. And I think there's probably lots of different lenses on exactly the same thing here, which is essentially stepping outside of your comfort zone in a way that is sustainable, but very action oriented. I'm terrible for thinking and not doing. I mean, maybe you might think otherwise from seeing me putting all this content out, but part of this is actually me really trying to challenge myself to actually start putting things into action as opposed to just thinking about them in my head. And I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I also read, and I do all this journaling, and I think a lot, and I listen a lot. But the thing that I find the hardest is actually then translating that into something tangible and action oriented. So, for example, in this podcast creation journey, like I went through literally a month or two of just going round and round in circles, trying to narrow down my vision. But I had every excuse in the world why I couldn't actually start recording. And, you know, I had stories around, I need to like paint the room before I can record it because it's too dark to record. And I need to get a good camera, and I need a good chair that's going to look good in the video. And my camera's not good enough quality. The sound is not good enough quality. And I just had so many excuses and reasons why I shouldn't actually step forward and just start doing the thing. And I would plan like episodes and think about the kind of conversations I was going to have, but I wouldn't actually sit down and have a conversation, even just solo chat. Like I wouldn't even start, because that felt, I didn't even know why I wasn't doing it. I think I was just trying to almost just distract myself by doing other things rather than facing the fear of actually taking that step and putting myself out there. But I remember there was like this one day and I was like, right, I'm going to do it today. Like I have to record the introduction. And I ended up doing it, but it was really hard. And then I felt exhausted. And so this is the thing that's really interesting. And this is where the concept of committed action that I mentioned in acceptance and commitment therapy, I think is really valuable. So they have the idea that there are these there's like an inner circle, a middle circle, and then an outer circle. So in the middle is your comfort zone. And that's like, you know, you're just living your day-to-day life. You're doing what you always do. You are maybe you're just comfortable there, and you're not necessarily taking those growth steps forward because you're kind of like, I'm safe here, you know, even though there's maybe this thing that I want to do, this is safe and it's easier just to not do anything. So I'm just going to keep going along and staying in my comfort zone. There's then this middle zone, which is the learning zone, the growth zone. And this is where you are taking steps. So you are challenging yourself and your beliefs, and you are taking action and steps forward towards your goal. But it's manageable and it's sustainable, and it's not something that's going to burn you out. And then the third zone is the panic zone. And this is where you don't want to end up getting to, because this can set you back immediately back to just staying in the comfort zone and not trying anymore. The panic zone is essentially when you've gone too far and you found that you've taken maybe too big a step, too big a risk for what you were comfortable with. And it was actually made you feel deeply unsafe, and therefore you resort back to that comfort zone, maybe even with a dysregulated nervous system, and it just essentially stops you being able to do anything further. And I found this balance really, really hard in this journey, because I know that I need to take these steps forward. And it's so important to actually start actioning the things and having the conversation and putting yourself out there and taking those steps towards where you want to go. It is also so easy to push yourself too far. And for me, actually, there was one day, I think it was like last week or maybe the week before, when I released episode 1. And it was pretty scary, like releasing that episode. You know, putting myself out there into the world, that was a big step. It was something I had to commit to. But I was comfortable with doing it on Instagram, because the people who follow me here at the moment are generally like quite a small group and people that I know well and I feel very safe with. But I also decided to post it on LinkedIn, and I find LinkedIn a really strange place. I feel like everybody is on their best behavior. No one is showing the more vulnerable parts of themselves. I mean, some people are for sure, but I think a lot of the time there's this almost surface level vulnerability. And what you actually see the majority of the time, or at least what I see on my LinkedIn, is a lot of people, you know, they're thrilled to share that they've started this new role and everything's perfect, you know? And I just found it pushed me slightly too far to post this on LinkedIn. I just found it terrifying, and ended up, retrospectively, at the time I was like, this is a good step, it's pushing me out of my comfort zone, but I think it actually sent me into that panic zone. So rather than growth, I went into panic, and I was like, oh my goodness, what are people going to think of me? This is too much for me right now. I remember my heart rate was really high. I was like shaking. Bear in mind, to probably most of you listening to this, you're like, what's the big deal? Like, you just post it on LinkedIn, probably nobody's even really spending any time looking at my post. But for me, at the time, it just felt so scary. And I just remember that whole week, really, I'd been putting myself out there. I'd shared on Instagram, I'd shared in my work, I'd shared it on LinkedIn. I was exhausted. And my creativity and my ability to then do anything else that week was literally at zero. So I had to go back and take some time, maybe go into the mountains. I can't remember what I did, but I had to just essentially step away from it to allow my nervous system to regulate itself again. And I think this is where that balance is just so interesting. It's this question of taking steps, actioning the things rather than just thinking about them or writing them down or listening to podcasts, but not going to the point where you're actually like super scared. And if you do that, you just need to basically factor in time to allow your nervous system to re-regulate itself before you move on to the next step. And I just think it's that period that's really hard. And that's the one where I nearly gave up. I nearly gave up a few other times, but this period in particular was when I literally thought, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to have to just stop. And I really nearly, luckily, I have also done a bunch of work and reflection on my values and what's driving me forward with this podcast. And that's where it's so important to come back to those. Like, what is your core mission? What lights you up? What are your values? How can you move towards those? In that context, I'm like, okay, remind myself why I'm putting this out there. Why does it light me up? What conversations am I inspired to have? And just really, really remember those in that time when I am feeling like I can't do this anymore. So that's my first section, I guess. Yeah. And the importance of action, but also allowing yourself to do that in a regulated way where you're not pushing yourself too far. That is the summary. So number 2 is the idea of progress, not perfection. And some of you might have seen this on my Instagram. It's been my wallpaper as well on my phone. It just says progress, not perfection. And it's something that they talked about at the very beginning of The Artist's Way, but it has been really hard, again, to actually remember to do this. So with the concept of progress, not perfection, one element to that is the progress piece, which is reflecting on how far you've actually come and the wins and the steps that you've actually taken retrospectively, and acknowledging that also it takes time. It's not like something, you're not going to make massive change overnight, especially when it's a bit of a stretch goal and something that you're not super comfortable with doing. It's going to take time. So it's focusing on the progress rather than the actual end goal, remembering it takes time, and also acknowledging the steps that you have already taken and where you've got to. And this is instead of perfection, right? Because I think that it's a shift from focusing on this goal of like, this has to be perfect, and actually focusing instead the fact that, okay, maybe it isn't perfect, but it's about the journey to get there. And actually that is just as interesting and as fun as the end goal itself. Like, maybe one day, this podcast will be like really well produced and it's got really good sound, and like there's more than one person working behind it, right? Like, that's not necessarily my goal at this point. I don't really know where this is going to go. Maybe that might be what you deem as like, well, at least what I would deem as the kind of perfect podcast. And at the beginning of this journey, I kept looking at podcasters on Instagram and thinking, oh my goodness, like the quality is just so high, and how am I ever going to get there? Like, I don't think I can do this. And I had to really dial back and just think, these people did not get there overnight, right? Everyone has to start somewhere, and it's going to be imperfect at the beginning. Any creative journey or thing that you're trying to put out there into the world is not going to be perfect at the first try. And to be honest, it probably never will be perfect. that's another thing. Like, even if you have this team and this amazing setup, like, it doesn't mean that it's then you've reached this point of perfection. So it's so much more about the journey and about showing up imperfectly and being okay with that. And again, this comes back to this thread of being able to feel safe in your nervous system to be able to do these things, because actually getting to grips with doing something imperfectly is terrifying. Like, again, it's scary to do that. It's, for me at least, to show up and do something where I feel mortified at myself is really, really hard. And so it's a balance between obviously doing imperfect things, but not like destroying your nervous system in the process and ending up like too scared to do anything else. But yeah, a core message of this piece is it's okay to be rubbish and it's okay just to make progress rather than something being perfect. Maybe if you're listening and you're a perfectionist, or you're starting to think maybe from listening to this you might be a perfectionist because you resonate with the fear of putting out things into the world that aren't like perfect or up to your like highest standards, maybe this is resonating for you. And I think there are actually so many parallels with this progress not perfection idea, and then also stepping out of your comfort zone, because the other piece is that in so many cases it's just safer not to do it, right? And that's why we don't put ourselves out there and show up imperfectly, because it's much safer to just stay in that comfort zone, not put yourself out there, and resist any change. So this has been a big process for me. I feel like I'm definitely not there. I'm still terrified about putting things out there that are imperfect. I mean, and that is part of the reason that I'm trying to do, again, these more chatty episodes, where my goal is to not over edit it, not worry too much about the quality of what I'm saying, but just speak from the heart and put it out there and know that that is good enough, and people will still take things away from it, even if it isn't like top quality production grade, you know? So this is literally me in action, I guess, trying to do that. I know what will probably happen is that I'll look at this afterwards and I'll think, oh my goodness, there's all these things wrong with it. Update from me in the future. This is indeed an accurate prediction of how I would feel when editing the episode. I think this is where it's interesting that the concept of perfectionism isn't about, in fact, I should read this from my book. I have this here. Yeah, so she says, perfectionism has nothing to do with getting it right. It has nothing to do with fixing things, and it has nothing to do with having standards. Perfectionism is a refusal to let yourself move ahead. It is a loop, an obsessive, debilitating, closed system that causes you to get stuck in the details of what you're writing or painting and making, and to lose sight of the whole. So I feel like that is the crux of it. It's like, okay, yeah, sometimes there are standards. Like, obviously, if I record an entire episode where you can't hear anything, I'm obviously not going to put that out there. But I think perfectionism and the fear of putting imperfect things out there into the world is more of a refusal to let yourself move forward. I think that's the crux of it. It's like finding all the reasons why you can't do something and refusing to let yourself move forward. So again, as with anything, it's all a balance. Do what feels safe for your nervous system. Like, find a time when you're in a good space to be able to make those steps and to move beyond your comfort zone. Also, like, you're allowed to have standards, but also it's not like, as soon as it starts to become debilitating and actually preventing you from moving forward, that's where you might need to start challenging yourself to focus on the progress and not the perfection element to it. And okay, the third piece that I really wanted to share, and this is quite specifically from The Artist's Way, and it's something that I really resonated with. And maybe for those of you who have a bit of a creative side that they want to explore, this one might be specifically interesting for you. But this is the idea that creativity is essentially about letting go. Again, I'm going to read a little extract from The Artist's Way. A painting is never finished. It simply stops in interesting places. A book is never finished, but at a certain point you stop writing it and you go on to the next thing. A film is never cut perfectly, but at a certain point you let go and you call it done. This is a normal part of creativity, letting go. We always do the best that we can by the light that we have to see by. And I think this one is so interesting. And again, like the other two, it all really does link, but I love this idea that a big part of creating is the letting go piece. It's deciding this is good enough and I'm good enough for this to now be finished and to move on to the next thing, right? It is part of that process of allowing yourself to move forward by letting go of the idea that this needs to go on and on and on forever before it's even possible to share it. And so this can literally apply with I think any creative process. It's the idea that you have to everything by definition in life is constantly changing, it's constantly in flux, and therefore it's constantly unfinished. There is no finish line. So you have to be able to get good at drawing that line in the sand and saying, we stop here and we move on. And so much of the fun of it is actually having something that is unfinished and imperfect. And ultimately, if you let go of that idea, then really shifts the dial from a place of lack and a place of wanting more and not having enough to actually feeling super inspired and enjoying the creative process. So yeah, I think this one about creativity, a big part of it is things being unfinished and also deciding when you're going to let something go and accept that there isn't ever going to be a perfect finish line. I think that's so, so important, and it's super liberating. And every time that I have a day where I'm feeling really creative, this is really the energy that I feel within me. I'm not trapped in perfectionism. I am creating and I'm free, and I don't feel stuck or limited by my own ideas of what good enough looks like. That one might be a bit specific to creativity, but I think it is really interesting. Just something that came into my mind then also is around how I mentioned how I can get so stuck in my head with perfectionism, and it really feels, if you were thinking about it somatically in terms of what it feels like in the body, when I feel like I'm in perfectionism, I'm literally completely in my head. I'm super thinking oriented, and I just feel blocked essentially. So an example is when I was recording the other day and I was having a bad day where I was feeling like I've pushed myself too far and I need to record this thing, but I can't seem to do it. I was literally sat there and I swear I did 10 takes of this recording. I maybe did a minute each. I kept starting and then restarting and then restarting again. And every time I'd get to about a minute or a minute and a half into the conversation, and then I would not be able to go any further. It was like I was just completely trapped in my head. And I totally felt like I was in this headspace of lack and not enoughness. And it was so debilitating. I couldn't create, I couldn't be me because I was in this thinking headspace that was blocking me from literally doing what I wanted to do and putting out into the world what I wanted to create. And so in that situation, actually the best thing for me was to just step away from it and to get outside. Went and sat by the pond in the rain, then had a nice evening with Hamish, my partner, and then had a nice sleep and got up the next day and it just all came out. Didn't feel like I was blocked. And so sometimes I think that's the other thing. If you find yourself in that headspace, remember to go away, take some time, allowing your nervous system to recalibrate. You've been doing this hard thing, you've been stepping out your comfort zone, and now you're finding you're blocked and you're scared and you can't do it anymore. Go and do something that you love. Stop thinking about it for a bit and then come back to it and allow that inspiration to flow again. So I think that's where I want to leave it. There's just a bit of an update on the things I've been learning and the things I've been practicing. And hopefully some of this might be inspiring for you as well in your own creative journey or your own personal growth journey. And it may be that you've heard this kind of thing a lot, but maybe it was just a useful reminder, because I often think with this kind of thing, you can't really be reminded enough. So anyway, I hope you have a great week. Maybe taking some small achievable steps outside your comfort zone that also allow your nervous system to stay regulated. And yeah, I wish you a wonderful Monday or whenever it is that you're listening to this. Over and out. I hate those goodbyes. I never know what to say.